Our neighborhood has always been typical. White picket fence, suburbia. On the outside. Every generation, new young couples move in to replace the older people who have finally left after a lifetime of the same lawns, the same friendly faces. It's always been an idyllic setting in which to raise a family and turn old and gray. Everyone here knows each other. Most have since they were kids, moving into their parents' home once their parents decided it was time to finish out their years somewhere else. I'm an oddball because I'm a transplant. None of my family have ever been able to afford the houses in this area. I'd always driven by with my mom in her beaten-up station wagon, ogling the beautiful homes, meticulously landscaped lawns, and lush green trees. I grew up and was the first in my family to go to college. I didn't waste the opportunity afforded to me and got a nice cushy job, a kind and caring wife, and a couple of rambunctious kids. The little American dream that was my life was finally wrapped up in a tight little bow when, at the closing, I was handed the keys to my own slice of paradise. We'd only been here for a week when I realized just how odd my neighbors were. At first, I just thought it was because I was a stranger, infiltrating their bubble. But the bubble itself seems to have burst altogether. I began to notice that when the neighbors waved to each other while doing their respective yard work, it was a little too forceful, an accompanying grimace painted across their faces that they tried to sell as a smile. The knocking at our door was just slightly too insistent, and the handshakes they gave to welcome us to the neighborhood were just a bit too firm. Their hair was just a tad too perfect. Their eyes were perpetually blank. I began to watch them unashamedly staring at my family, and whenever we ventured out the front door, their neighborly facade seemingly beginning to crack. They were just staring with the same dead eyes that I've begun to grow accustomed to, and each time I returned their gaze, I felt my muscles tense, and had an overwhelming urge to put as much distance between them and myself as possible. That's when I began to hear things in the dead of night. There was a strange scratching from along our siding, a gentle scraping of something sharp caressing the exterior of our home. It didn't last for long, just a few minutes at most. I peered out the window to see if I could spot the source of the noise, seeing instead a neighbor leering at me through their living room window, their whole house illuminated against the oppressive blackness of the night. In the morning, I inspected the perimeter of my house and found nothing out of place. There were no footprints in the mulch, no marks on the siding. There were no trees with branches close enough to the house to make that noise. I shrugged it off the best I could, but all through work that day, the mystery lingered in the back of my mind. The next night, the scratching returned. I peeked again and found no culprit, but did find 3 lit-up houses and 3 neighbors, the original and 2 more, staring in the direction of my home. The next day I called out of work. When the first neighbor emerged to do his daily weeding, I made my way over to him, knowing I needed to see if he'd let me in on what's going on. As I approached, he affixed his unnerving smile and shouted, "Howdy, neighbor." "Hi, Steve," I replied, attempting to return his smile. "How you doing?" he asked me, as I noticed that he'd gone an unnaturally long time without blinking. "I'm okay, thanks. I wanted to ask if you'd seen anything in my yard the past couple nights." For the first time since moving here, I saw a flicker of something in one of these robo-people's eyes, and that something was clearly fear. Steve paused a moment before saying, "He's been outside your house. We've been keeping an eye out for you, though. He doesn't like the light." Who is he, and what have you been watching for? Steve's eyes glazed over again before he said, "I think I hear Marcia calling me. Good to see you, Cal." And he did a 180 turn before marching away. That night there was no scratching. I looked out the window, and Steve's windows were as dark as the night was black. 5 other houses on the street stood illuminated with their occupants gazing directly at his house. I returned to bed and drifted into an uneasy sleep. I awoke to screaming, loud and shrill, coming from the direction of Steve's. I hurried to the window and saw Marcia out in the yard, sprinting and shrieking, bathrobe whipping in the wind. I felt the sweat begin to erupt through my palms, and heard my wife stir behind me. "What's going on?" she asked, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. I ignored her. I stood, rooted to the spot, watching Marcia as she continued to run down the street, before a hulking figure that had been lurking in the shadows rushed her. She was caught and hurtled into the air, her cries ceasing immediately as she was dropped to the pavement where she laid, unmoving. The figure turned to me before slinking back into the darkness. All I could do was stare with the same blank eyes my neighbors had. "Go turn on all the lights," I told my wife. It was the worst blizzard since 1975 here in Wisconsin. They're calling it the storm of the century. The blizzards here are brutal. A few years ago, there was one so bad that traffic came to a dead stop. After being on that frozen highway all night, I try to hunker down when there's a blizzard. Just me and my German Shepherd, Max. We've mostly been watching movies to pass the time. Then suddenly, right in the middle of watching The Godfather, I heard a knock at my door. Max went ballistic. This was an unusual reaction from him. It startled me. My house is pretty secluded off a remote highway, so I don't get many visitors, even in good weather, leaving me to wonder who's out here at 10 p.m. in this weather. I grabbed my pistol and tucked it in my waistband before heading to the door. "Who's out there?" I asked. After a brief moment of silence, I got a reply. "Hey there, my name's Carl. My truck slid off the highway a couple miles back. I came out here looking for shelter. Do you mind if I stay here?" I watched Carl through the peephole before responding. I couldn't tell what, but something about him just seemed off. Something wasn't quite right about him. I brushed it off. I figured I'd probably look a little odd after walking a couple miles through a tundra. "All right, get in here, Carl," I said, opening the door for him. The wind outside was howling, making it tough to shut the door behind him. Max really went postal at Carl when he entered. Max was usually a little weary of strangers, but once I'd invite them in, he would settle down. Except that didn't happen this time. I tried to calm him down, but I couldn't. I decided it would be best to put him in the bedroom for a while. When I came back out, Carl was taking his snow-covered coat off. "You got real lucky, Carl. There's a lot of less trusting folk around here. Sorry about the dog. He's not usually like that." "Thanks," Carl said, shivering. "Hey, what are you doing out driving around in the second day of this storm? You should have stayed home. Real dangerous to be going out for anything in weather like this." "My power went out. I was trying to make it to my brother's house, but it probably wasn't my best idea." He seemed to be telling the truth, as far as I could tell, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about this guy. Max was still going crazy in the other room. It was starting to concern me. "All right, do you want some coffee to warm you up?" I asked. He nodded his head in response. When I turned around to pour him a cup, all the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I knew there was something off with this guy, but I couldn't tell what. "I'm just being paranoid," I tried to reassure myself as I handed him the mug. I hit play on the movie and it started playing again in the background. As Carl held the warm mug in his hands, I watched him intently. My phone vibrated. It was an emergency alert that read, "Warning, do not let any strangers into your house. murderer out pretending to seek refuge from storm. I looked back up to Carl. He sat there just looking at his mug. I started to walk to the other room. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah, I just gotta grab something real quick." I opened the door to the bedroom where Max was and grabbed my shotgun. Max followed me back to the kitchen, barking as we approached Carl. I racked the shotgun, loading a slug into the chamber. "Hands up and turn around slowly," I ordered. He sat there for a moment before moving. He stood up and turned around, looking me in the eye. "What's this all about?" he asked innocently. "It's time for you to leave." "Please, no. I'll freeze." "I'm sorry, but you need to leave. Now." It was in that moment Carl smiled. That's when I realized what was off about him. His mouth had too many teeth. Way too many teeth. They were sharp and jagged. Then he charged at me. He was quick. Almost too quick. I just barely had time to pull the trigger before he reached me. The shot knocked him to the floor and left a large hole in his chest. But no blood came out. He looked back up at me and grinned even wider now as he tried to get up. I fired again, leaving a hole in his skull. But it was clear to me that the shotgun wasn't going to stop this guy for long. I ran to the door, slid on my boots, and ran. Max followed close behind. As I hopped on my snowmobile, he hopped into my sled in the back, and we took off. I zipped through the woods. The snow was deep, and I was getting pelted in the face by snow and twigs. We didn't make it too far before I hit something and lost control. I flew through the air and into a tree. I woke up to Max trying to drag me by my coat. I struggled to get up. My head was spinning, and I was running off sheer adrenaline. I made it to my feet, and I could hear twigs snapping in the distance behind me. Max and I took off running through the woods. It was difficult, with well over a foot of snow on the ground. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like jello. But we pressed on, unsure of how close that thing was. After what felt like hours, we came to a clearing. I could see a light in the distance. It was a house. I felt a sense of relief as we ran towards it. When we got to the house, I pounded on the door. "Please, help," I yelled out. After a few long moments, the door opened. Suddenly, there was a gun in my face. Max started growling. "Quiet," I told him, and he settled down. I pleaded with the man in the doorway. "Please, help me. I let that thing into my house. I let it into my house. It's not human." The man didn't lower his gun before responding. "I heard about you on the news. Get out of here before I shoot you." "No, please, you don't understand. I let him in my house. He almost got me." "Go, now take your friend back there with you." I turned around to see that thing approaching. No. That's the thing that's killing people. Watch this." I pull my pistol out of my waistband and fire 3 shots into his chest. It keeps approaching, unfazed, with a wicked grin on its face. "You see that? That thing's not human. Please help me," I pleaded with him. "All right, get in here, quick," he replied quickly. I looked out the door as Max entered behind me to see it getting even closer. What do we do? What do we do? Well, shooting it doesn't seem to do much to it. Maybe it's like a Wendigo, and we need to burn it. He starts grabbing various bottles of liquor from a cabinet and starts pouring them on the floor in a circle around his living room. We'll lure the bastard into the circle, and once he's in, we'll light him up like a Christmas tree. Suddenly, the door was ripped from its hinges. We started shooting as it approached with a grotesque smile on its face. The moment it entered the circle, I grabbed a burning log from the fireplace. The creature's smile faded quickly as it grimaced, but it was too late for the creature as I threw the burning log on the ground in front of it, setting it ablaze. It made a horrible, ear-piercing screech as it was engulfed in flames. The flames quickly spread, setting the house ablaze. We ran outside to escape the flames. We both collapsed into the snow, coughing from the smoke. "Sorry about your house," I said to the man. "It's all right. I have insurance," he chuckled back. In that moment, I felt a deep sense of relief that was quickly interrupted by a man who came out of the forest and said, "A house fire in a blizzard. Now, that's just bad luck. Any chance you two have seen my brother Carl?" He smiled as he approached, revealing a mouth full of sharp, jagged teeth. It was supposed to be the safest time of the month. Seriously, there's only a small window every 28 days or so when any risk exists, and I was the furthest point from it. That's how I found myself in the rural space between San Antonio and Austin a few weeks ago, traipsing with my tripod and praying to whatever deity that would listen for a break in the clouds. "Just hang out at the campsite," Mitch had told me as he cracked another rolling rock. "We can still kind of see the eclipse when it's cloudy." I didn't buy a $1,913 Nikon Z9 for kind of, I answered as I packed up my Corolla. "I'll follow the sun." So I left the friends who had driven with me to Texas and headed out alone, desperate for some solar clarity. I'd been waiting 7 years for this and didn't want it ruined, which is why I pulled off the road and climbed through a field that seemed to be entirely composed of thorns and bugs. I'm sorry I messed with you, Texas, but what the hell? Anyway, I was out by myself in the middle of nowhere, which is how all intelligent decisions start, when I heard it behind me. I had no desire to turn around, of course, because I had finally, almost, sort of, gotten a good angle of the eclipsing sun in an extremely narrow patch between clouds. Then it happened. I still get chills thinking about it. I experienced nighttime at 1:30 p.m. By myself in the field, I looked around at the world I thought I knew and I saw something different. Heart pounding, I peered into the lens and took as many pictures of totality as I could. The sounds behind me got louder at that point, but I wasn't about to look back. I'd driven from LA for this. Totality would only be a few minutes. I just didn't have time. But the noises got closer. Something was moving toward me in this field that I thought was abandoned. Heart beating faster, I kept my eyes on the lens, not wanting to miss a second. I told myself that I wasn't afraid. I was lying. What was creeping up behind me in the dark? At this point, I was more afraid of seeing it than anything else, but I told myself that I couldn't look and miss even a single second of the solar event. It got closer. I ignored it. Then its hot breath steamed my neck. I whipped around and stared at my sunny darkness intruder, ready to attack with my tripod. Have you ever seen something so perfectly horrible that you can only feel removed from the situation and awestruck? That's how I felt when the wolf that wasn't a wolf because it was bipedal and 6 feet tall leered down at me, his jaw and tongue dripping low with hunger. I fought hard against the need to pass out then and there. I understood immediately that I would be devoured for certain if unconscious, but only very probably if I stayed awake, so I focused on remaining upright. You've never really been afraid until you truly think you're going to die. I tried to run. That immediately failed as the anthropomorphic wolf pounced. I hit the ground hard and saw stars. My head spun with pain. My dwindling thought was that at least the skies had lined up to see me off. Then it got brighter. The wolf paused an inch from my chest, his wet nostrils flaring, staring at me with human eyes. He opened his mouth and lowered it to my shoulder. It got brighter still. The eclipse was ending as he brushed up against my skin. I held my breath, completely frozen. He opened his mouth right as another break in the clouds brought the sun powerfully back. I braced for pain in my chest, but that was overridden by the agony in my ears as the wolf howled loud enough to be heard back in San Antonio. I was powerless to stop him, and I lacked any credit for the fact that he sprinted as far from me as he could get. I never saw him again. "Did you get any good pictures of it?" Mitch asked. He let out an enormous belch. "Huh?" I asked, my voice shaking as I threw all my camping gear into the Corolla without bothering to bag or organize it. "You chased that eclipse into a godforsaken field. I hope it was worth it." I slammed my trunk and spun on him, shaking from head to foot. "Don't you ever talk to me about what's godforsaken," I spat. He stared back at me, one eyebrow raised. "Okay, man, jeez, just asking." He folded his arms. "What's eating you?" Totality was on April 8th. A solar eclipse can only happen on a new moon. I've been working very hard at trying to forget it ever since then, but it's very, very difficult to forget something when you're working hard at it. I thought I was almost there. I was eventually able to sleep through the night without waking up in a cold sweat. But over the past couple of days, it's been getting worse. It started as an itch. Now there's a fiery pain in my shoulder that feels like it's building into something bad. I tried to ignore it, which is, of course, brilliant advice for any medical condition. It can either get better or worse, right? That makes a 50-50 chance. Then it got more painful, and I wondered what the worst could possibly be. That's when I thought to look at the calendar. It made no sense, of course, but none of what happened to me does. We're a week away from the next new moon. It's the exact opposite point in time from a full moon, exactly when I'd least expect an attack. I don't know what to do. I've been in denial of the fact that it's getting more difficult to handle silver, or my sudden craving for very rare steaks. I can't handle another week of this, especially if it's going to get worse, which forces me to ask the question, after the new moon arrives, what then?